everyone, and welcome to this month's Wildlife Wednesday. I'm your host, Tenley Thompson, and we've got some great wildlife adventures to show you from all over the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Let's start this week with some fresh footage straight out of Yellowstone of wolves and their howling, brought to us from Sarah Ernst and Josh Metton.
Hi everyone, naturalist Josh Metton here. I've just returned from leading a 6-day winter wolves and wildlife of Yellowstone adventure in the world-famous northern range of Yellowstone National Park. That clip that you just saw and heard was of the Wapiti Lake Pack howling together from one of our first mornings in the park. Thanks to my co-guide Sarah Ernst and our friends over at Green Adventures who are on the trip with us. The howl of a wolf truly is a symbol of wildness in North America, and we are so fortunate to be able to hear it again today in Yellowstone. Today, the northern range of Yellowstone is one of the best places in the world to watch wild wolves. You may be wondering, why do wolves howl? From what we know, it comes down to a few main things, including territoriality and pack cohesion. So territoriality. Wolves are highly territorial and will aggressively defend their pack's turf from neighboring packs. However, they are also risk-averse and try to avoid conflict through other means. Wolves use their hypersensitive noses above all other things and will scent mark along the edges of their territory in an effort to avoid other packs. Howling is another form of territorial marking. We hear a significant increase in howling starting in late fall and continuing throughout midwinter. This is believed to be a result of increasing wolf movements due to the upcoming mating season in February. In the example in this video, a big group howl might be to let other wolf packs in the area know that the Wapiti wolf pack are claiming this location as their own. Pack cohesion. The purpose and frequency of wolf howls seems to also change with the seasons. Once the breeding season ends in late winter, wolf howls decrease significantly and shift from being more territorial between packs to between wolves within the same pack. In spring and summer, wolf packs are most concerned with taking care of their pups, and territoriality becomes less of a concern. Research shows that wolves are often able to identify the individual howls of other wolves, so howling could also help them locate each other when separated. A few years ago, my guests and I watched as Little T, a wolf in the Lamar Canyon pack, stopped across the river from us, howling to packmate 926F, who was behind us on the opposite side of the road. After a bit of hesitation, Little T eventually crossed and caught up to the rest of the pack. It's possible that the howl was his way of saying, "Wait for me!" Today, Yellowstone National Park, especially in the winter, is one of the best places in the world to hear wild wolves howl. Observing these apex predators, along with diverse wildlife including bison, elk, moose, eagles, waterfowl, and more across the stunning landscape of Yellowstone is an experience of a lifetime we can't recommend enough. From Ecotour Adventures, this is naturalist Josh Metton. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Josh and Sarah, for that great footage. Now, Sarah is still up in Yellowstone with a different group getting even more footage of wolves that she sent me some great sneak peeks on. So hopefully we'll have some of that footage for you throughout the month, and certainly we'll be showing you some of that for our March episode. In the meantime, let's come back down to Grand Teton National Park and check in with Kirk, who's got some great wildlife tracking to show us.
Hey everybody, it's Kirk here. I'm out on a little cross-country ski tour. Hasn't snowed in a few days, so I think that we'll have an opportunity to find a lot of tracks out here. The winter is one of my favorite times of the year because although it seems kind of quiet and dead and desolate and cold, it's really quite active. I think there's a lot of animals out here hustling to make ends meet and leaving these tracks behind for us to find. So follow along with me today and I'll be able to show you what I find out here. So we've got our first set of tracks here belong to a coyote. They're certainly a canine's track where you get a footpad here and then 4 toes, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can draw an X between these toes and the foot pad. That tells us that it belongs to a canine. And I don't think that they belong to a wolf because it's not a very big track. You know, maybe half the length of my finger, a couple inches. I've seen wolf tracks about the size of my hand. I'd expect a coyote to be making its way through the forest here, maybe looking for rodents, maybe like mice or voles, or maybe even squirrels. Something to feed that metabolism and help this coyote carry through the winter and generate heat. And there goes these tracks. Now, while this isn't a track in the snow, I think that it's a pretty interesting piece of sign. What we have here in this aspen tree are a set of bear claws. And I'll zoom in here so you can see that for yourself. Maybe a black bear was climbing this tree, looking for a safe place to rest in the fall, or maybe accessing some sort of food resource up there. But regardless, it's left behind this sign for us to know that it was here. And I just think it's so cool to find these tracks, the sign, and bring to light what was here when we couldn't see it. I think that it really brings a forest to life. Here's another track that belongs to a pretty small animal. A small weasel called an ermine that's jumping along, putting its whole body into each track here. And I'll show you that we can see where it's landed, and then it's jumping out and scraping this snow and putting its whole body into the next jump, and the next one, and the next one. And I can see their tracks all over this place because they need to stay really active in the winter. They're long and slender, so they lose a lot of heat, and that means that they're constantly hunting. Maybe listening, searching for mice under the snowpack, moving into their dens, feeding on them, digesting them, metabolizing and generating heat, and then moving along, looking for their next victim. If you're a person, I think, they're really cute. They're one of my favorite animals out here, the ermine. But if you're a mouse, they're kind of a monster. All right, we've got a big track here. Looks like somebody might have been walking through here without any snowshoes on, post-holing through the snow. But instead, I can tell you that this track belongs to a moose. These moose have long legs that'll penetrate through the snowpack, and flexible hip joints that allow them to pick those legs up and out of the snow, almost like a swimmer, picking their arms up and out of the water. And then this depression here is where a moose decided to take a rest, probably a digestion break, where it's gonna regurgitate some of the twigs and buds that it's been nibbling on and chew on them for a little while longer, just to break them down a bit further before sending them off to its other stomachs, where they'll be fermented and lipids and proteins will be extracted. So maybe this moose sat down here for an hour or two and then left behind the evidence of the digestion process and then continued onwards. What I think we found today is not only a lot of cool tracks, but when you are hiking around, skiing around with a more intentional eye, the forest is going to open itself up to you and tell you all of its secrets. And today we've seen tracks from ermine, moose, and coyotes, and so many more.
A big thanks to Kirk for taking us out on his adventure the other day. So, it's been fun to see where everybody's joining us from. But if you haven't told me yet, I'm having a great time reading in the comments where everybody's joining us. And don't forget, after we show you the latest videos from Jackson Hole in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we'll have our trivia question of the week, and then I'll be answering your questions live. So if you've got questions for a wildlife biologist, or anybody in your family, young or old, has one as well, I'd be happy to answer them. In the meantime, I've got kind of a treat for you. We oftentimes have Laura featured on the show talking about some of the amazing wildlife sightings she sees, but you don't often get a chance to really pick her brain on some of the amazing knowledge that she possesses. So let's hear from one of the best experts on bears that I've ever met, Laura, talk a little bit more about hibernation.
Hi everyone, this is Laura. This time of the year, in the middle of the winter, we all want to imagine our local bears snuggled into their dens, all happy, safe, and warm until spring. In the spring, when they come out of their torpid state, they're going to be just as strong as when they went into their den in the fall or early winter. Although they've lost some fat reserves over the winter, they do not lose any of their muscle mass. And to me, that's quite amazing. Bears are able to recycle proteins within their body and also waste products in their body, which are processed during their torpid state. Let me explain. To me, wild animals have evolved with traits that make them able to perform like superheroes. If you were a superhero, what trait would you want to have and why? Would you want to have long claws to be able to take down big prey? Would you want wings to be able to fly? Would you want to be able to swim to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and survive there in the dark? Or maybe you want to live in a really dry place like the Sahara Desert. For bears, their superhero trait is that they're able to sleep or go into a state of torpor or light hibernation for months at a time. And when they get out of bed, they're just as strong as when they went into their den in the fall. For humans, if we could adapt that behavior or adapt the ability to recycle nutrients within our body, we might be able to go to a different planet. We might be able to travel to Mars. We might be able to stay in a coma for a long amount of time. We might even be able to fix ailments like kidney diseases that afflict many people. When our bodies, or the bear's body, is functioning normally, we create a waste product called urea. Urea is created in the liver when we break down proteins or amino acids, and then it's transferred into the bloodstream, where the kidneys will filter out that urea into the bladder, and then we pee it out. But sometimes, like in the case of a bear that's in hibernation, they're not excreting anything. They're not going to the bathroom throughout the winter. Also, if a human has a problem with his or her kidney, then that could mean excess waste products or excess urea and nitrogen could build up in the bloodstream, which will make you pretty sick. So bears have developed this system to be able to recycle urea within their body and turn it into useful material, including protein, to reuse it during hibernation. This gets kind of complicated, but please bear with me. This is pretty interesting. When bears are in their dens, we assume that they're just sleeping, but in reality, their bodies are performing complex conversions to convert waste products into proteins that they can use. And don't worry, at the end of all of this, it will result in bear farts. So, of course, we're starting out with that urea stuff. It's produced by the liver, which goes into the bloodstream. Normally, the urea would then pass into the kidneys, which filters out the urea into the urine, and then that's what makes the yellow snow. But in this case, a bear's not going to the bathroom because he's in his den. So the urea passes into the saliva instead. And then that saliva is swallowed by a sleeping bear, which enters the intestines, which house special bacteria. And the bacteria help to break the urea down into bicarbonate and ammonia. Ammonia gets transferred into protein. And the bicarbonate, which is more like a waste product, gets broken down by acid created by the bacteria, which is then separated into carbon dioxide and water. Water helps to keep the bear from getting dehydrated, gets reabsorbed into the bear's system, whereas the carbon dioxide gets farted out as bear flatulence in the den. I'm assuming that bear dens are very stinky places. So we can add this metabolic conversion to the superhero traits that bears possess. Other cool things that they can do are climb trees. They can dig their own dens. A bear can do about 50 yards in 3 seconds. They mate in the springtime and then give birth to their cubs in February. And if you scroll back, check out some of our other episodes, I'll explain that too. But thank you for watching. If you have a superhero trait that you'd like me to know about, please mention it in the comments. And I'll see you next time.
So, always an awesome and entertaining segment from Laura. So next, I've got our last wildlife video. And remember that after that, we've got our trivia question and I'll be answering your questions live. So make sure you write them as you think of them and I'll get to them one by one. But I thought it would be fun to send Tyler Greenlee out to go and take a look at an amazing piece of land that sometimes can be overlooked in the shadow of Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Park, but is part of the reason we have such wildlife diversity here in Jackson Hole. And that's the National Elk Refuge. Let's go check it out.
Cervus canadensis, Yellowstone and Grand Teton's most abundant herbivore species, elk. My name is Tyler Greenlee and welcome to Wildlife Wednesdays. The animals behind me and in the surrounding landscape are extremely dependent on their winter range, the landscape that we have set aside for these animals to survive the winter in. Basically, the entire area surrounding Jackson, Wyoming and Jackson Hole is owned by the public. There's the National Park, the National Forest, and the National Wildlife Refuge system. And that has allowed over 11,000 elk to survive on this landscape. I really believe that other people in other states and other parts of the country can learn from this. If we set aside large tracts of land for wildlife, we can preserve and have animals on the landscape. Elk are the North American equivalent of the red deer, and they migrated during the last ice age across the Bering Strait that separated Siberia from Alaska. These elk originally evolved on a tundra landscape, and after the big icebergs and glaciers melted, separating the United States from Alaska, elk dispersed into the lower 48 states. Historically, elk survived in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and many states back east. However, they have now been extirpated from those areas. As part of the conservation for this species, animals from Yellowstone have been brought to many of these eastern states. In Tennessee and in Kentucky, we now have about 10,000 elk surviving out there. Elk have also been distributed to many other areas in the western United States as well, including Arizona and California. And what's pretty amazing is that the elk behind me have survived in the Yellowstone ecosystem for at least the past 6,000 years. Elk, like so many other herbivores in this ecosystem, are extremely migratory. We are standing here on the elk's winter range, which is why, if you look behind me, we have huge herds of elk behind us. We have about 500 animals, and these herbivores, these elk, are digging underneath the snow to get at the grass. In the northern summer part of their range, in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, the snow is so deep that these animals would starve to death if they did not migrate. That is why we have the National Elk Refuge down here, and why we have hundreds of elk and other animals scattered across this reserve and landscape. Now, most of the food that they are foraging for is covered in a couple feet of snow. Now, down here at these lower elevations, the snow isn't so deep that the elk can't reach that grass. But what they have to do to get down below the snow to reach those forbs and the food that they're surviving on is they actually will dig with their front hooves and their front legs. That is really important to note because up north, the snow is so deep they can't actually dig through it. That is why we have huge concentrations of elk down here. It's because the snow isn't deep enough that they can't reach their food. Other herbivores like bison have a different adaptation. They have a huge hump on their back with really strong muscles that reach down to their heads, and they can use their heads and swing them side to side like a giant shovel. The elk can't do this. They have to spend huge amounts of energy during the winter to actually dig through the snow. This is extremely energy consuming. And these elk during the winter are essentially starving to death. They are surviving off of their body fat and their food reserves that they stored up during the previous summer. Now, these elk are highly concentrated here, and what that means is that wolves, mountain lions, and other predators are going to follow the elk into these valleys. We are on the National Elk Refuge that has about 8,000 elk on it during the winter and about 60 wolves. Because food is in such short supply on the elk refuge, what we often see is that these female and bull elk do compete heavily for food. Oftentimes you will see two individual animals approach each other and tilt their heads up, and that is antagonistic behavior where they're sizing each other up. Oftentimes a dominant cow will approach a foraging female with her head held up high and will push that other elk off of a patch that she has dug up and effectively steal her food. And so these animals are competing, and they will, in a sense, cheat the system. A cow that is stronger than other individuals will, of course, steal food from her. And that is something we have been observing recently. As the winter and the snow has gotten deeper and the winter has gotten harsher, we see elk competing more and more for the limited resources out here. Now, some survival strategies that elk have to survive predation in the winter include clumping up in these big herds. This is essentially a safeties in numbers aspect. Hopefully, if a predator does approach this herd, the predator will select a different individual. And so safety in numbers is definitely one of the survival strategies for elk out here. Another survival strategy is evasion. Elk will avoid areas where there's high concentrations of predators. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Tyler Greenlee, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
So, a really fun segment on the National Elk Refuge from Tyler. All right, so those are our wildlife videos for this week. Lots of great questions for me to answer in a little bit. And thanks so much for you guys for your watching and your interest and your comments. I'm just having so much fun following along. And a big special thanks to folks who are new joining us this month. Remember, we have Wildlife Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, the first Wednesday of each month. So it's time for my second favorite part of the program, which is our trivia question of the month. So we always have a sponsored trivia question from our EcoTour Adventures store, which we started during the first lockdown for COVID as a way to support our employees. To this date, 100% of all the earnings from our EcoTour online store go back to our employees. So if you'd like to support us and help support this program and support our health insurance and benefits and all sorts of other fun things, Maddie, who's moderating our comments section this month, will go ahead and put a link up for me in the comment section. You can check it out. But our featured item is modeled by Chris, one of our office staff this month. And it is our Face Buff, our EcoTour Adventures Face Buff. Okay, so the CDC these days is saying you should wear a face mask while out in public, and then you should wear a second layer. And if you're out in cold temperatures, this is the perfect second layer. You can be stylish and safe at the same time and support our guides, right? So you can't lose. Definitely check that out on our store. And a big thanks to Chris in our office, who's, when you call our office, that you might be talking to Chris or Katie, who is agreeing to model for us this month. If you have enjoyed this program and you just want to tip some of the guides who have produced these videos for you to watch for free, we do accept tips on our online store as well. Feel free to go and swing us $5 or whatever you want in return for our monthly content. We certainly appreciate that, and it certainly helps support our benefits. All right, so last month's trivia question, which was a long time ago, and I do appreciate that, was to name one of the major peaks of the Teton Range that stretched from the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort to the end of the range and the the Flag Ranch Memorial Parkway / Yellowstone. So that nearly 100-mile long range, I wanted you to name one of the major peaks, but you weren't allowed to name either the Grand Teton or Mount Moran because that was going to make it too easy. And as many peaks as you can name were entries you got into our chance to win that $10 gift card to our EcoTour Adventure store, which would get you a long way towards that buff. So a lot of you guys did really, really well. I challenged the guides who were watching the show last month to try and name me all the major peaks from the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort in the south all the way to the end of the range in the north. And I was pretty impressed with our crew. People actually were pretty darn good at it. Not something I've ever asked the guides to do before, so I was really pleased. I will note, we accepted all of the major peaks except for the Grand Teton and Mount Moran, because of course they're so big and obvious. But we also decided, just because this was kind of a hard question, that we would accept some of the more minor peaks like Cloudville Dome, Cemetery Spire, Storm Point, some of these slightly more obscure, certainly not a major peak, but it still is a Teton peak. So we kind of let you guys who went for those, we let you have them. So that question has already been awarded. Did you get it right? Were you able to name one of the Teton peaks? I'll give you a hint. 3 of them have Teton in the name. It's not just Grand Teton. You could have said Middle Teton or South Teton. Those certainly would have been acceptable answers as well. But that's last month's question. Now it's time for this month's question. Okay, so if you want to win a $10 gift card to our store, all you'd have to do is answer the question correctly, and one person from all the correct answers will be drawn at random to win. I'm going to make it easier since last month's was so difficult, and I'm going to make it a multiple choice question. Is everybody ready? Okay, so there was big news this month in that, oh, by the way, this month's question comes to us from Tyler Greenlee, the biologist from the last segment there about the National Elk Refuge. He came up with this question. So, Wyoming Game and Fish announced it had managed the oldest bear in the Greater Yellowstone's history, and that's Grizzly 168. This is his mouth shown here, and he had outlived all females documented in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem by over 4 years. And remember, female grizzly bears tend to live longer, and you can sort of very barely see that little lip tattoo there on his mouth that says 168. Now, sadly, this bear was in really poor shape. Check it out. He's got 3 working teeth, and I don't know if I'd say that they work. And he couldn't get wild prey anymore. He was too old, and I think arthritis and poor tooth condition had made a really hard situation for him. So he was going out on cattle ranches, and he was actually, this sounds funny, but probably would be brutal, he was gumming cows to death. He was basically grabbing them and just gumming at them with those worn out teeth, and the pressure and the bruising was actually killing the cows. So he'd become a cattle killer in desperation in old age, and so he was put down by Game and Fish and was euthanized. He just wasn't in good enough condition at that point to have any other options. My question about Grizzly 168 is how old was this grizzly? Now, for those of you guys who've been following Wildlife Wednesday, you may know how old, for instance, Grizzly Bear 399 is, and she's really old, right? She's considered about as old as you normally get. So this really blew our minds, and that's the only hint I'm going to give you. Go ahead and tell me how old Grizzly Bear 168 was upon its death. A, Was the bear 27 years old? B, was the bear 31 years old? C, 34 years old? Or D, 46 years old? Go ahead and give me a guess in the comment section. And if you guess correctly, you'll get a chance to win that gift card. So let me know what you think. Really unbelievable news. Absolutely crazy, crazy stuff. I've never seen 168 in person. In fact, I don't really know anybody who really has. I think it was a real backcountry bear, not a bear I was familiar with. Really, really amazing stuff. That was incredibly cool to see. Too bad, of course, the bear had to be euthanized, but unfortunately, probably a mercy at that age. That bear was really in rough shape. So there's this week's trivia question, or this month's trivia question. Go ahead and give us an answer. We'll go ahead and we'll tell you next month what the correct answer is, and choose a winner in the meantime. All right, it's time for my favorite part of the program, which is I'm here to answer your questions live. So if you've got a wildlife biology or Greater Yellowstone ecosystem or Jackson Hole related question, or even, oh gosh, I answer questions about all sorts of things, animal related questions, weather related questions, you name it, go ahead and ask me in the comment section and I will go through them one by one and get you all some answers. Now, I'm going to be looking at my iPad, which requires me to be looking down. So if you're wondering what on earth is going on, that's how I'm seeing your questions. So bear with me here. Oh gosh, we're getting lots of correct answers. Some people definitely were watching the news about that bear and how old it was. Really unbelievable stuff. So, I think what we'll do is we'll start at the top in terms of questions and kind of go from there. Okay. Linda writes, do you think the coyotes that are howling in my suburban neighborhood when an ambulance or fire truck goes by are marking their territory similar to the wolves in the first video, or are they doing it for other reasons? So, Linda, obviously we can't read canids' minds, which is why when Josh was talking about why wolves howl, these are theories only. But we do know that when one pack of wolves or coyotes howl, it'll oftentimes cause another pack of wolves or coyotes to howl, and that's because they are basically saying, this territory over here is ours, you don't want to come over here, this is our area, do not enter. And the other pack is saying, we're big and tough and strong, and you don't want to come mess with us either. It's a little bit like catcalling, so to speak. When an ambulance or fire truck or what have you goes by, it sounds a bit like howling, and it is a reaction that's instinctual. So dogs will howl at howl at coyotes howling, but they'll also howl at fire trucks. They'll also howl at ambulances. They'll even howl if you howl, right? And coyotes and wolves will also respond to howling and fire trucks and ambulances. Now, I do want to point out, you do not want to call for coyotes or wolves in a national park. Remember that if you call for these animals, they have to respond and oftentimes have to come and investigate what could potentially be an intruder who could harm their pups. And so you're making them waste a lot of energy to try and answer you. And that's not a very nice thing to do. But I do know that, of course, once the howling starts, you're oftentimes going to hear all the other neighboring packs answer, even if it's coming from an ambulance. So my suspicion is that your coyotes are responding to the ambulance going, we're tough over here, don't come invade us, you ambulance, in coyote. So hopefully that answers your question for you. All right, Apache Jim Pack asks, who's new this month, thank you for watching. Have you ever seen any signs of Bigfoot? I have not seen any signs of Bigfoot or any other cryptozoological animal in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I do have my eye open for some animals, however, that are definitely not supposed to be here that I wish were here. So a really good example of this is we have a very rare in Wyoming bird here called a long-billed curlew. They're really cool. They're little shorebirds with these super long beaks, And there is a bird that looks almost identical. Maybe we can get Maddie to Google both of these, called an Eskimo curlew. And when I was in college and taking courses in ornithology, I had a world-renowned professor who was an amazing guy. And he said, and this is back in like 2002, that he thought that 2 of the 7 species of bird that have gone extinct in the United States were actually still present, but just hadn't been seen. And the first was, of course, the infamous ivory-billed woodpecker, and he thought it was in Arkansas. And the second was the Eskimo curlew, last seen in the United States in 1949, I want to think, and in Cuba, I think, in 1955. So long time gone. And he thought if they existed anywhere, they'd exist in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So it's a little bit like looking for a mythological animal. They've been gone so long that the odds of Eskimo curlew living in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are pretty remote. But I don't know if you guys remember all the hubbubaloo a couple of years ago when somebody thought they found an ivory-billed woodpecker. I think it was in Arkansas, just like my professor was talking about. Still a lot of debate on whether that was or not. There hasn't been a single bird sighted after that, so hard to say whether that was one. But every single time I see a group of long-billed curlews, I am obsessed with looking with my binoculars and checking just to make sure that it's not an Eskimo curlew, because come on, who wouldn't want to be the discoverer of a long lost thought extinct species of bird? I mean, how cool would that be, right? So no, I have not seen Bigfoot, and I haven't seen an Eskimo curlew either. I did, however, when I was teaching elementary school kids how to snowshoe a number of years ago, cut out some cardboard Bigfoot feet, and I put them on the bottom of my snowshoes, and before the kids showed up, I actually tromped through the woods with my big footprints. And we went on a search for Bigfoot. I think it was a Yeti, actually, which was the perfect way to get second graders out on a hike in Grand Teton National Park, and they certainly enjoyed it. So I have impersonated Bigfoot, but I haven't seen Bigfoot. So great question. Thanks so much for asking that. Let's see here. Stacy asks, bear question. Some posts indicate that folks are worried that some of the cubs won't survive through hibernation, thinking of grizzly bear 399 and her 4 cubs this winter. So, great question. I get asked this a lot. And Stacy, I'll just say the odds and the statistics are not in 399's favor. But I will also say that the odds and statistics are never in 399's favor, and she always pulls it off anyway. So, most grizzly bear cubs, by our best estimates, face a 50% mortality rate before the age of 2. So remember, they stay with their mother for 2 years, and then they face an additional 50% mortality rate between the ages of 2 and 4, which is that subadult phase. And sadly, when it comes to 399 and her cubs, that subadult phase has been particularly deadly for her offspring. They are roadside bears, they are used to people, they have a certain human habituation, which then makes them more likely to be hit by cars, get into garbage, go after cattle, and all of these problems when bears and people interface between the wilderness and when they get into human use areas. So, the odds are not in quadruplets' favor. If the odds are 50% survival with mom, then that would mean out of 4 cubs, you'd lose half of them. However, I have been saying this for years for every set of triplets she's had. And guess what? She's raised every group of triplets to adulthood. Noted she had some help from her daughter for one of those, but the point being is statistically she should have lost far more cubs before they reached subadulthood, most of the cubs before they reached subadulthood. And while she has lost cubs, mostly to being hit by cars or getting separated from her, she's never lost one of the triplets, and she so far has managed to raise the quadruplets for what will be very soon here a year. So from a statistic perspective, yeah, there's a great chance that we're going to end up with fewer cubs than quadruplets. From an amazing parent perspective, gosh, she's really good at beating the odds. So, great question. That's all I can really tell you on that. We can all hope for the best, right? All right, let's see what else we got here. Bonnie asks, Some elk were brought to West Virginia too. Yes, Bonnie, that was actually a relatively recent reintroduction of elk. They were brought between, I think it was 2016 and 17, or 2016, 2018. They came from Kentucky and Arizona. I think I've got that right. Maddie can Google, but I'm pretty sure I've got that right. And they're really probably the most recent elk reintroduction. The Wyoming elk herd has been responsible for quite a few reintroductions over the years. And in fact, all of the elk you see in Colorado were originally reintroduced to that state in 1913 from the state of Wyoming. So that National Elk Refuge is responsible for a lot of the repopulating of elk around the world, well, around North America that we see today. So great question. Mark asks, are elk insulated like moose where the snow stays frozen on their bodies? Also, any idea what the current snow totals are for Jackson Hole this season? Mark, I don't know the totals. I know we're a little bit below average. Maddie, I think you can look that one up for me too. I'm keeping Maddie hopping today, guys, but I'm sure he'll be able to post that in the comment section for you. As for elk being adapted to winter conditions and being well insulated, yes, they're just like moose, although moose take it a little more to an extreme, which is to say their body has a double coat. It has a downy kind of underlayer and a guard hair overlayer, and those layers interlock, and that downy layer traps heat next to their bodies, and that top layer keeps more cold air from coming in, and they're so well insulated that when it snows, as you can see in those videos, the snow doesn't actually melt off of their backs. If it snows on your arm, you're pumping heat out into the environment. It'll melt instantly on your arm, but if it snows on an elk's back, it's not going to melt. They also have that really neat vascular system in their legs that's providing insulation for the rest of their body when they're lying down. So great question, awesome stuff. I'm so impressed by how much you all know. That's really cool. Let's see here. Oh, Bethany says, Pennsylvania's 2020 elk estimate was recently released. They have 1,350 elk there now. Actually, that's amazing. I never would have guessed there were that many elk in that state. She says it sounds pathetic compared to out west, but they are here. It doesn't sound pathetic compared to out west. You got to start from somewhere. And I'm so happy to see elk returning to the eastern seaboard where they once lived. What a great success story. Elk have really struggled with population problems throughout our history. And so it's really good to see elk doing so well and completing those ecosystems, bringing wildlife back that have been expatriated and locally extinct for many generations. So really neat to see. Natalie says, my dad lived in Jackson in the 50s and 60s and insists the elk are or were fed there in the winters by humans en masse. I say he's wrong. Can you shed light on this minor family dispute? Natalie, you're not going to like this. In fact, a lot of people don't like this. But your dad is correct. Yes, elk are fed on state feed grounds for elk, and they are also fed on the National Elk Refuge. And this takes a lot of people by surprise. There's a wonderful book on the National Elk Refuge, which is well worth a read. But the title of the book really sort of sums up what the National Elk Refuge is. And the name of the book, it's made by a former manager of the refuge. It's called Imperfect Pasture. That's what the Elk Refuge is. It is an imperfect pasture for wildlife. When we settled in Jackson Hole, the first homesteaders used up the land that elk had traditionally used to survive almost since the last ice age. And when that happened, they left the elk a very, very small area of land to graze on. Then they filled the valley with cattle, who then all summer long ate all of the forage that the elk rely on. Now remember, these elk are migrating from as far as Yellowstone National Park to come down to the refuge every year, because remember, as Tyler was saying, that's where the snow depths are lower. So we average around 70 inches of snow per year in the town of Jackson, where I live, which is right next to the National Elk Refuge. Up in Yellowstone National Park, you can get up to 1,000 inches of snow per year. That's 50 feet of snow, and it doesn't melt between storms. You can't dig under 50 feet of snow to find food and grasses. And so the elk have to migrate or die. When we left them this very small area left to live, the elk starved to death. The early teens on the National Elk Refuge were devastating. The cattle ate all of the grass that the elk needed, and the elk had a massive die-off. And one year was so bad, this is a little morbid, but it's true. They say you could have walked from the town of Jackson to the famous Miller Butte on the National Elk Refuge and not touched the ground. There were so many deceased elk who didn't make it through the winter. And the local people were horrified. They certainly had not intended to create this mass starvation event. And so when there was enough public outcry out east to insist that something be done for the elk, and Congress created the National Elk Refuge, the local people helped by voluntarily giving up their homesteads when they were out on the National Elk Refuge and moving to other areas so the elk would have somewhere to live. The problem is the elk refuge isn't big enough to support the entire southern greater Yellowstone ecosystem elk herd. There's not enough space for too many animals. And we don't have the land that they need. Even if we were to take the entire town of Jackson and South Park, where elk also once lived, and raise it to the ground, it's unlikely the elk would be able to return to using those areas. So the damage is done. All we can do is the best we can with what we have. And so historically, since 1912, we've actually supplementally fed elk populations, both on the National Elk Refuge and in feed grounds throughout western Wyoming. Originally, we would feed them hay. At first, it was try to bring the population back because the local people needed the elk to survive. It wasn't like there were grocery stores in those days. And hay actually is very problematic for elk and their digestion. It causes these small scratches in their gums, which can develop into a disease called necrotic stomatitis. And they may have actually killed more elk than they helped until Olaus J. Murray, a very famous naturalist, figured out that this was an issue in the 1940s and 50s. After that, they began to feed them alfalfa. Today, they feed them alfalfa pellets, and the U.S. government is a massive buyer of alfalfa pellets as a result. This poses some problems, and we're not going to get into all the issues today, but basically you've got sort of two things going on. If you don't feed the elk on the elk refuge, they'll leave the refuge, go out onto the cattle ranches, push the cows out of the way for hay, eat that hay, which isn't good for them, and of course consume forage that those ranchers have worked very hard to grow and raise for their cattle. It's not easy being a cattle rancher, and it's a whole lot harder when the elk come in and eat all your forage. If you stop feeding them, then you've got a human issue. You've got a human conflict with wildlife. The other problem is if you keep feeding them, then they very easily transmit disease, including a very problematic disease called brucellosis, which is a European cattle disease that can be very harmful to the cattle industry. So if you feed them, you have the potential to harm cattle. If you don't feed them, you have the potential to harm cattle ranchers. And we now have evidence of chronic wasting disease in the valley, which would be very devastating to the National Elk Refuge herd. How devastating? The bets are still out, but probably inevitably will, of course, affect them now that we have tested positive animals in Grand Teton. So, the federal government has committed to reducing feeding with the goal of eventually eliminating feeding. But this is very controversial. Outfitters, folks who rely on elk for hunting, want there to be a surplus of animals. And so they want more feeding, not less feeding. And they're very upset about this. And the interface between all of these different needs, the needs of outfitters and hunters and cattle ranchers and conservationists, the needs of the elk and the needs of the moose, who are getting overwhelmed by an overabundance of elk, are all a little bit different. And finding a balance and a compromise between all of the parties is really the great challenge of my and the next generation. How are we going to balance the needs of the elk and the people and of Jackson Hole, which isn't getting smaller in population through time, and do what's in the best interest of everybody? Now, if you want to pick up our local paper, a couple times a week this controversy comes up. So there's lots more information online about all of this, but pretty fascinating to watch, and we can certainly keep you updated here on this. So I didn't mean to start a whole drama controversy, but hopefully that tells you a little bit about some of the crazy socioeconomic politics that come with wildlife and wildlife management here in Jackson Hole, and some of the hard questions and difficult decisions that we as humans have to make in terms of how to best manage wildlife for the best interest of all. So hopefully that answers you a little bit. Let's see what else we've got here. Let's see here. Great questions this week, guys, or this month. Let's see. Aw. Jennifer says, I've sure missed your weekly shows. Thanks, Jennifer. I've missed being with you guys every week, but I'll still be here every month, and it's such a pleasure to be spending the first Wednesday of every month with you all. Let's see. Oh, Sadie asks, did you miss us all as much as we missed you? I did, you guys. It was such a highlight of my week every week. But I'm still going to be here. It's going to be great. We've got a whole new year of fun wildlife videos for you to watch. And wait till you guys see what Sarah Ernst got out of Yellowstone this week. It's amazing. We can't wait to show it to you. Let's see here. Bill asks, has there been an additional spotting of the wolverine caught on camera in Yellowstone National Park? Man, you guys are up to date with the greater Yellowstone ecosystem news. I'm impressed. No, we haven't heard any more about that. But I will tell you, every, 2 or 3 years, somebody does spot a wolverine with a game cam somewhere in Yellowstone or Grand Teton. And that's all we get. We know that they're present in the ecosystem, but they're so rare and incredibly difficult to see. This time of year, almost all are at high altitude, eating mostly bighorn sheep carcasses. Bighorn sheep who make bad decisions in the winter will feed a wolverine for the whole season. So we haven't seen any more footage of that, although I'm sure they're keeping a big, strong eye on it. But we might not, right? And it might be a year or two before we hear about another one. Wolverines are not listed as an endangered species. And very recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declined to list them as an endangered species, which is really too bad because their population is incredibly low. And we don't know if there are enough of them to find each other and reproduce. So there's actually a lot of concerns about wolverines in the United States. But we're so excited to see that one was found. So great. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see here. Libby asks, what's the name of the local paper? Our local paper is the Jackson Hole News and Guide. You can find it online, but any of our Wyoming, Idaho, or Montana papers would cover quite a bit of this. The Wyoming Tribune Eagle certainly is going to talk about CWD and elk concerns. Papers out of Bozeman, Idaho Falls, West Yellowstone, Cody, they're all going to cover it. But if you want to know about Jackson Hole News, Jackson Hole News and Guide is our local paper. All right. Maddie points out we call it the NAG locally. News and Guide, NAG, get it? Yeah, for sure. All right, I think I got everybody's questions. Guys, this was so much fun. It's such a pleasure spending this time with you all. I hope you had a great time. I answered some of your questions. You enjoyed some of this video. Do let me know if I didn't get to your question. I promise I'll check it out in the comment section if somehow I missed it, or you've got a question throughout the week. You can ask it here. We'll answer it. You can always message us on our Facebook page as well. It's such a fun time every single time I get to do this. I hope you all have a wild month. You stay safe, and we'll see you out there next month. So long.